Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Airability Inspirability, where Airability works hard to try and use aviation to try and keep the community together using the magic of aviation. And it's a real pleasure to introduce a fabulous transatlantic guest today, a really exciting one. So, without further ado, I'll hand you over to John Windover, our fabulous host. But as ever, just a quick reminder that we're working hard to keep everybody going during these tricky times. So if you could maybe make a small donation just to help support this inspirability program, if you enjoyed today, that'd be really appreciated. I'll put the link on the screen now and again during the talk, and also you can find it in the video context text underneath the screen on YouTube or Facebook. Okay, let's say hi to John.
Hi, John. Hi there, Mike. Yeah, I'm very good, thanks. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Very good. Yeah, it's exciting times with the air show coming up next Saturday. That's ready to coming together nicely, isn't it?
It really is. In fact, I saw it mentioned in the press, the International Armchair Air Show, which of course makes complete sense. We've got some incredible guests and participants. This really is the chance to live out all your aviation dreams, go back in the time capsule, see some iconic aircraft, and also go into orbit. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure you've all seen some of the social media posts have been coming out, but this really is an event not to be missed, and that's going to be next Saturday. So we'll be working hard this week to bring the final plans together.
Brilliant. Okay, well, let me over to you, John. I'll leave you to introduce our guest.
Thanks, Mike. Well, so we are in for a treat today. So we're going stateside, as Mike mentioned, to California to be specific, and to a guy who spent a career in the US Navy. So it's my pleasure to introduce you all to Commander Vincent Aiello, known to his friends as Jell-O. How you doing?
I'm doing quite well, John. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. So normally at this point, when we introduce our guests, we embarrass them with their career highlights, and I have to say I struggle to keep it on a page of paper. Your career is just fantastic. I think you've lived out the dreams of many of us aviators who've perhaps not had the chance to fulfill some of those dreams that you had when you were young. And I'm going to run through the list now. It's fantastic. So 25 years in the US Navy, about 3,800 hours, 3,200 of which were on all models of the F-18 Hornet. You have 70 combat missions over Iraq primarily, and also 700 carrier-arrested landings. Now that is something I think we're all really, really keen to understand, and of course the takeoff as well, or the catapult. But your career started in 92 when you were commissioned into the US Navy, and you got your wings in 95, and then your love affair with the FA-18 Hornet began when you were posted to I think it was Naval Air Station Cecil Field in Florida, and very quickly you ended up going on operations to the Arabian Gulf in support of Southern Watch on the USS George Washington and the USS John F. Kennedy, and then. Well, where did you end up next? It was Top Gun. It had to be. So to the US Navy Fighter Weapons School. Again, that's going to be a highlight for today for us to get some unique insights into what it's like to be a student, but also as an instructor. You then moved on to some more operational assignments, back to the Gulf twice, deployed onto the likes of USS Nimitz, and back onto the George Washington. The operational CV here is particularly impressive, and we got some really good video coming up on Hornet operations off the carriers during that period. But you got punished for flying too much, and you went to be staff of the commander of the US Third Fleet in San Diego. So perhaps at least where the US Navy's home is. That was in 2010, and then coming beyond that, you went to the US Navy's aggressor program on the F-16. That's going to be interesting, So we all know the Top Gun movie. You have to help the guys train and be the adversary. So understanding how that worked would also be very interesting for us to know. You then went to the Fleet Readiness Centre at Naval Air Station North Ireland, where you were the F-18 Integrated Project Team Program Manager and also the Super Hornet check pilot. So, no doubt bringing to bear all of that experience for the benefit of the US Navy. So that's going to be good to hear as well. But you retired finally in 2017, and you now have a podcast, which is how we found you, which is the Fighter Pilot Podcast. So keen to know all about that, and we're going to give it a huge plug because we have to return the favour. We're taking up your time in your morning, so hopefully we can get our listeners to listen to some of your stuff. Talking to the likes of the fighter pilots that come from other parts of the world. So with that, that wonderful introduction, seeing your career flash before your eyes, it's great to have you along. And I think the first question all of us would be keen to know is what set you on the path? What was your aviation interest? Who sparked it? What sparked it?
Well, thank you for that, John. I have been extremely blessed and continue to be. So I am mindful of that as you read those different events through my life. Thank you. My mother married a gentleman who became my stepfather in the mid-70s, and he had an interest in air shows because of the technology bent. And indeed, he owns a technology company to this day. And so he took us because he liked to see, for example, he remembers vividly one time at one of the air shows, a gentleman had a Bic lighter and he lit it and he held it left and right. And the seeker of an AIM-9 Sidewinder heat-seeking missile was there and it tracked it. And my stepfather's eyes got real big. Well, so he liked to go to air shows and he took us, his new children effectively. And I became smitten. I saw the aircraft and heard the noise and saw the fast flybys and peered into the F-14 Tomcat at 8 years old and said, this is what I want to do. And I made it amazingly. Not everybody does, but I did. And it all started at an air show.
Yeah. And you know what? How many people can recount a story similar to that? That's certainly one that I can recount. Biggin Hill, which is a place near where I live. Again, same thing, being inspired by, the big jets. And so why the Navy? And what was the, what was the path to the US Navy?
There are things in life that I think people just know. And with all due respect to the Air Force and the Marine Corps, I knew I wanted to be in the Navy. I lived near the ocean. My mother is a Danish immigrant to this country, and her family is part of the heritage of a large shipping company. And so the Navy was just in my blood, or I should say the ocean was in my blood. And so the Navy just seemed the logical choice for me.
Yeah, sure. And then, of course, you have to, walk into the careers office or, take that leap of faith. And then, of course, you go into your training. So tell us a bit about that. I mean, how does it work?
Well, I'll tell you, my stepdad, when I was in 10th grade in the high school, sat me down one day. I can remember the conversation vividly. And he said, what are you going to do with your life? You'll be out of high school in a couple of years. And even though I loved airplanes, my brothers and I used to fly the remote control airplanes when we were kids. I just, as many 16-year-olds, thought, well, I don't know, I'll figure something out, right? And he said, well, you talked about being a fighter pilot. Why don't you go for it? And so he helped me ultimately apply to the United States Naval Academy, where I was not accepted. And so instead, I found my way through what's called a Reserve Officer Training Corps program, where you go to a civilian college, but they provide you a stipend towards your costs, your fees, if you will, and then you do military courses. And when you are a graduate of the program, then you're also commissioned into the Navy in my case. And so in the summer of 1992, I was both a college graduate from UCLA as well as a ensign in the United States Navy. And so I was on my path. Wow.
Okay. And so you essentially you graduate, and then the flying starts. You've been sort of indoctrinated into the service. So where did that begin? And tell us a bit about the aircraft you flew and that journey up to the front line.
Sure. Well, after commissioning, I reported to the Cradle of Naval Aviation, which is in Pensacola, Florida. It's in the Panhandle on the far west side. And that is where all new pilots and aircrew arrive for their training. Now, at the time, there was still a backlog of pilots, partly as a result of the 1986 movie Top Gun. So they had far more applicants than they had spots for. So I actually reported in the summer of 1992, but did not start flight school until the summer of 1993. But at that time, it was about 6 weeks of ground school where you learn some basic meteorology, aerodynamics, propulsion, navigation. And then from there, you report to a training squadron where at the time I flew the T-34C Turbo Mentor. It's a low wing aircraft and it is a propeller driven aircraft. And so the picture you see here is actually me then later in front of the T-2 Buckeye, which was my first jet. And then I later flew the TA-4J Skyhawk based off the Vietnam era fighter, the Skyhawk A4. And so it was a lockstep of let's learn how to fly and handle emergencies. Then let's learn how to fly in formation. And then let's learn how to fight and drop bombs. And then later, let's learn how to land on an aircraft carrier. So it is very much a sequence of events. You don't just show up all of a sudden one day off the street and go to land on an aircraft carrier. You spend years preparing for it.
Yeah, of course. And so talk us through the day when your instructor said, right, go on then, go to the carrier. How was that? I mean, obviously, I guess you do it dual. What's the process of getting you to the point of your first carrier landing?
Right. Well, in the T-34, you do normal flared landings because it is a smaller aircraft designed for that. But beginning with the very first jet, the T-2 Buckeye, every time you come back, and in fact, every mission, no matter what you're learning to do, whether it's basic instruments or formations or dropping bombs, when you come back, it's expected that you'll do a handful of touch and go landings with the same light source that is at the carrier. It's called a lens, as well as the runway will have painted on it an area that is intended to look like the flight deck of the carrier, at least the landing part of it. And so as you come in, you do this pattern work, effectively, your audience would know it as, and you're expected to fly the same pattern that you would fly at the ship. So it's repetition. So if you are a fan of sport, let's say, and you want to be good at maybe batting in baseball, well, maybe you can get a pitching machine and you can set it to just fastballs and you can just sit and hit and hit and hit, or swing, probably in my case. And so the idea is you do it over and over and over. It's the repetition, it's the muscle memory. And so then you don't go to the carrier in the T2, although you used to. But then later in the A4, the procedures are the same, but the aircraft is different. And again, all through the training, you do those landing practices. And then at the end, they have what's called a boat, which simply means the squadron has coordinated the schedule of an aircraft carrier, and they know it's on a certain coast at a certain time. And you show up with all your aircrew instructors and all the folks, and the ship is ready. And they brief you that morning, and you fly out by yourself, solo, and you wait overhead the ship, and you look down and you say, holy smokes, how am I going to do this? And then you go down and do it. And it's experience you'll never forget.
Yeah. And how did the training prepare you? I mean, obviously you talk about muscle memory and the checks and the speeds and everything else, but that moment you go over the carrier, talk us through the feelings you had that time.
Well, you have significant butterflies in your stomach. You have doubt, in my case, frankly, that you can do it and do it well. You have trepidation. You have a whole range of emotions. And what I think the military training tries to instill in you is it's okay to have fear. The question is, what do you do with it? And so you have to compartmentalize, and you have to put into place those procedures that were hammered into you over and over in all those landings, as well as in briefings in classroom. I mean, we would have discussions with landing signal officers, which are simply pilots with the collateral duty to help you land on the ship. And they would have these verses, effectively, you would say in your head or out loud to try to build it in. So if you see the ball, which is the light source that we use, if you see it in a certain place, you know what to do. And you've said it over and over, almost like a seance, so that it just becomes a part of you. And so when you go out there, yeah, there's all those emotions, but you know the numbers around the pattern, you know roughly what the light source will look like, you know what the flight deck will look like because you've seen pictures and briefs and videos, and then you go to do it, and it's a trial by fire. And I remember my very first couple passes. The first time I was too close to the aircraft in front of me, so I was waved off. The second time my pattern work was no good, so I was too wide and ended up overshooting the carrier. And the third time I came down and was able to trap. My hook was down, which is good because sometimes you do some touch and goes also. But my very first landing, my hook was down. And what I will tell your listeners is if you look from the back of the ship to the front, there are on newer carriers fewer wires, but in those days there were 4 wires. So let's say the carrier is pointing up and there's 4 wires strung out, and this is number 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so you're flying this way. Well, with your hook down, you want to land right in the middle of this, which means you'll grab the 3rd wire. Well, I came down and my very first landing was on a 1 wire. So I was a little low there, but I did land.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. And I was going to ask the question a bit later when you transition to the Hornet on, just putting us in the cockpit when you're, going for a launch and then you're coming in to recover. So we'll follow that one on the
Sure.
the transition to the Hornet. We're about to get to now, actually. So you were successful on the T2 Buckeye, and then I guess do you get the chance to bid for what aircraft you want to fly? I guess in the Air Force, you've got a wide spectrum of fast jets to choose from, but not so much in the Navy. I mean, were you destined for the F-18 or how did that?
I guess if you believe in fate, I was. But in August of 1995, I was winged, and my girlfriend at the time pinned the wings on my uniform, and she later became my wife. And I put in a dream sheet, which is what you always do in the military, which is simply your way of saying, hey, if the opportunity exists, I'd like to have this first, but if not, then maybe this. And so you just have a hierarchy of what you hope to do. And then they start with the number 1 performing person and they say, okay, what does he want? Is it available? Okay, great. Here you go. Number 2, what does she want? Okay, it's available. Here you go. And so, excuse me, I did not finish at the top of my class. I was very average, and I put in for F-18s, and thankfully there were enough spots for it that I was accepted into F-18s. And the very first place I went, believe it or not, was a Marine Corps squadron where I was taught. And then I reported to, like you said earlier, Cecil Field, where when I walked out maybe a month later and saw my name on the side of an F-18, it was the culmination of a long time of hard work. And it was a proud moment.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. And that's a great picture there. And so you transition onto the jet. What were your first impressions? I mean, this is an awesome piece of kit, and from the Buckeye to the F-18 is probably a pretty big step.
It is a big step, and I'll tell you, John, it's funny because in flight school, you want to do your best because, as I just alluded, the ranking that you have dictates where you go next. And so it's not cutthroat. It's what we like to call cooperation, where you're cooperating with each other and you have friends in flight school, but you also want to do better. And so when I was accepted to the F-18s and I went to Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in Southern California, which is now closed, it was probably the best year of my life because I finally relaxed and I just enjoyed the training. Plus I was in a beautiful part of the state and I had friends there with me, and it was just a great time. And I ended up doing so much better, frankly, as my performance, because I was relaxed and having fun. And so with any aircraft, there's always this crawl, walk, run. So you start with the training, if you will, where you do it yourself. So it's either reading the books or the manuals, or you go in and there is computer-based training, and then you'll have classes with instructors, then you'll have simulators, and then by the time you get to the airplane, you know it pretty well, even though it's your first flight. And so you put in the effort. You're a professional pilot, you're a military officer, you're going to do what it takes. And I did. And I thankfully had the capability to learn the things and demonstrate the performance. And so it went well.
Yeah, that's great. And we're going to cover 2 topics coming up. So the first topic is, carrier flying. I mean, it's an environment that the majority of us have never, experienced or been a part of or even seen. And then we're going to move on to carrier operations in theatre.
Okay.
So actually, doing the job. So let's talk about the carrier, and let's talk about your job on the carrier. I mean, everything, the tip of the spear is you guys operating, projecting that air power off the carrier. But just give us an idea. I mean, it's a floating city, isn't it? I mean, how do you live on it? How do you work on it? How, give us some insights there.
It's an enormous ship. And the interesting thing is, John, that enormous ship, which is over 1,000 feet long, weighs 100,000 tons of displacing water when it's fully loaded, with almost 5,000 people, sometimes more than that, maybe 60 aircraft. It is a floating city, as you said. There are barbershops, post offices, there's fitness centers, there are places to eat, there are things to do, and of course, you're there to work. And so what you see is this symphony, if you will, of aircraft taking off and maybe landing here coming up in this video. And it's all choreographed. Everybody knows their job. And you know, from looking at the people there, for example, you see someone in a yellow jersey. Now you see one in a white. You got people in green. So you have colors, so you know what people are to do. And you don't just, again, you don't just show up. So for the casual observer who maybe sees this on TV, it seems like chaos and it seems so dangerous. And it is dangerous, don't get me wrong. But nobody just shows up day one and says, okay, go figure it out. You have training, you have briefings, you have mentors, you have on-the-job training in a controlled environment. And so it is an amazing place. But as is the case, I think, in the experience of human nature, once you've done it for a while, you take certain things for granted. So you become accustomed to the risk. You become accustomed to the noise and the chaos, and it makes sense. And you then have the standard things that people have. You have good days and bad days. You have disagreements with people. You have up days and down days. You might get an email or a letter from home and something's going poorly at home. And so it can affect the young sailors or yourself. And it's a lot like life in general out there, believe it or not. You have all these different range of emotions and different things that are happening. And then you go out into harm's way. And so you're expected to do a job in the face of uncertainty and in foreign locations. And it's just, it's a really interesting experience. It's hard to describe. And if you watch a movie like Top Gun, you get a glimpse of the fanciful side of it through the music and the footage. Or if you watch the PBS special from 2008, where you can really get to know the people, that gives you a better feel for it. But there's nothing like doing it for real. And not everyone, of course, has that opportunity. But once you've done it, it changes you, because it's like being, frankly, confined. You are on the ship and you go where the ship is going and you do what you're told.
Yeah, no, and it's I do remember seeing that PBS documentary, by the way. It was fascinating. So okay, talk us through a catapult launch. You know, how does it work? What's the team involved, and what's your, you know, what happens to you in the cockpit, and what's your role as part of that team?
Well, as the pilot, you are a little bit along for the ride on the catapult launches compared to the landings. Now, you have to direct your aircraft to the right spot on the deck, and there are what we call yellow shirts. A moment ago, I talked about the different colored jerseys you see. Well, the yellow shirts are the plane directors, and they are the ones that will use hand signals in the daytime or wands at night and taxi you and say, okay, come this way, okay, a little bit, okay, stop. And they will direct you exactly where you need to position your aircraft using nose wheel steering and differential braking to arrive on the aft part of the catapult track, so that then the folks on the deck, usually in green jerseys, can do their jobs. And that is, they have to hook up your launch bar as well as a holdback fitting. And then effectively what you have there is just a demonstration of amazing technology and physics at work. They will place the aircraft in what's called tension, where there's a certain amount of oomph ready to go. Think of a car revving its engine maybe at a stoplight, and then as soon as the light turns green, it dumps the clutch and goes. Well, there's all this tension on the aircraft, but there's this holdback fitting holding it. And so once you go to tension, you wipe out the controls. You might have seen this in videos. And then you look over your instruments, you look outside, and if everything's good outside, you get the thumbs up. And then you salute, they salute you back, and you put your head back. And at that point, you're just along for the ride, because what they do is they overpressure the tension for the shot, which breaks the holdback effectively. And then off you go from 0 to approximately 170 miles an hour in just a couple seconds. And it's a thrilling ride. There's nothing like it.
Yeah, I'm sure. And in terms of, you know, the weight of the aircraft, the type of the aircraft, the type of aircraft that's being launched, how does that work? I mean, can they regulate the force that's generated through the catapult?
Oh, absolutely. So there will be a young sailor on the flight deck in a green jersey whose job is simply to verify your weight. So they will come along with a board and they'll hold it up and they'll have the numbers dialed in. And if you're in an F-18, it might be 40,000 pounds. If you're in an SEP 14, which are of course retired, but back in the day, those could have been 60,000 pounds. And so they will dial that in for the pressure. Now, in the video you're seeing here, this is the traditional catapult that uses steam pressure. But nowadays they are replacing that with electromagnetic catapults. So you won't have all this steam. At any rate, the process is the same. You have the appropriate weight because they have settings. The shooters, who are officers whose job it is to make sure a successful launch, they take into consideration the weight, the wind, the density, altitude of the conditions that day, the sea state, whether it's pitching up and down, and everything needed plus your weight to say, okay, well, we're going to shoot you off the tip here, as you'll probably see in this video here in just a moment. And when you do, you might be just maybe 10 knots or not even that much above stall speed.
Wow. And so obviously you're catapulted into the air, you're doing what you need to do, then it's time to come home. One thing that's always struck me is the way in which you have to refocus your attention from, having probably been very saturated in the mission that you're flying, whether that's operational or training, and then coming back to probably a challenge of equal measure, if not more, if it's at night in bad weather. So just give us some perspectives, on the landings and how that works, because we can see some more footage here of the catapult launches, but we've got the angled deck on the ship. Why is that the case? And then how do you fly the pattern? And then how do you make sure that you land this aircraft accurately and safely?
Sure. Well, the angled deck, if I understand correctly, was actually a British invention. And the idea was, in the early days of carrier aviation, we had sufficiently slow enough aircraft and enough wires that a landing was virtually assured. If you waved off early enough, of course, you could go around or over the other aircraft. But it seems laughable now that the front part of the aircraft carrier was loaded with aircraft and the back part is where you landed. And so if you missed, you might go crash into those aircraft. And so as aircraft got faster with the jet age that entered into the Navy after World War II, they realized, well, this doesn't always work. That you might miss the wires, you might have to go around. And so we can't move all those aircraft out of the way, but we can move the runway. So there's a 10 to 11 degree angle on the carrier. And the idea is you have this piece of the flight deck that's reserved for the landings, as we just saw in the video a little bit ago. And so if you either wave off late or bolter, which is what it's called when you miss all the wires. And sometimes it's not your fault that you miss the wires. Your hook might not have the right pressure and it bounces off when it hits and just misses the wires. But at any rate, you need a place to go. And so you have the ability then to take off again with an angled deck. But to your point, a carrier landing, I would submit, is probably the hardest thing that is performed in an aircraft anywhere. I suppose perhaps the demonstration squadrons have equal challenges flying in such close formation during dynamic maneuvers, but a carrier landing is unlike anything else. And I did 705. I got to the point where in the daytime, okay, it was all right, but I never got comfortable doing it at night. It didn't matter how many, and I did, I think, 270. And it's just scary. It's dark. And on my podcast, we have an episode about night carrier landings, and we go into the procedures as well as the physiological emotions that go through you, because it's just dark in the middle of the ocean. I think people who live in a busy area like London, they're not aware that there's areas where there is no cultural lighting, and that's just simply the lights of a city. Well, when you're out in the middle of the ocean, the stars go down to the horizon. If you're lucky to have stars, if it's overcast, it's even darker. And here you are controlling an aircraft, trying to land it on an area that is extremely small. You're flying very fast. And if the ship is moving because of the seas, forget about it. It's a challenge.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about the landing signals officers, the LSOs. What's their job? I mean, they're obviously there to assist you, but how is that done?
They are there for the safe and expeditious recovery of aircraft aboard the carrier, and they have a collateral duty. So every 3 days or so, they will take their turn to go out and wave you. And they're standing about where you see right now, just behind where that aircraft touched down. They're on that left or port side of the aircraft carrier, out in the elements and watching each aircraft, listening. And assisting the landing, but also grading each landing, John, because by grading and creating a competition among pilots who are type A personalities, then you have a byproduct of safety. So if I get a better grade and I get a little patch to put on my jacket that says I was one of the top 10 pilots in the air wing, well, I'm going to strive for that, because who doesn't like bling, right? Mm-hmm. And so by striving for that, my procedures are ultimately going to be refined to the point that it just becomes a safer evolution. But they have certain procedures that they follow. They have equipment they have to know about, and they'll have certain communications that they provide to the pilot that is unambiguous, so that when they say to do something, I know exactly what they mean and I don't do anything else. Because when you're coming aboard the aircraft carrier at 140 knots, you only have split second to do the things that they need you to do to land in a very narrow area without it going badly. And there's certainly plenty of examples on YouTube and elsewhere of landings on carriers gone badly, and it can be very destructive.
Yeah, I'm sure it can be. And you know, if the jeopardy and anxiety is not enough for carrier landings, obviously, you know, the whole point of you being deployed onto the carrier is to exercise that that political intent of your country. So I'd like to move on to the operational side now. And you know, you've been deployed to the Arabian Gulf. Is it 3 times, Vincent? I think.
Well, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4.
4 times. So give us some insights into that. I mean, to my knowledge, it's mostly done at night for obvious reasons. So that, you know, again, more night landings. But tell us what you did, you know, and what the type of operations were that you were conducting.
Right. So a carrier arrives in the Persian Gulf or any part of the world as a result of U.S. policy and procedure, and part of that is diplomatic, part of it is economic and others, and part of it is military. And so we're an instrument of American policy, and we show up to do the things that they need us to do, which could simply be a presence a lot of times, which was mostly the case for my experiences, or you might actually have to engage in warfare and kinetic employment of ordnance. And so you do that. That's what you're there to do. You are a military member, like a soldier or any other. And so we would deploy to the Gulf. It wasn't always nighttime. One misconception about aircraft carriers that I think people have, excuse me, is that they think maybe like an airport, it's just open 24 hours a day. Well, that is not the case, because the folks that work on the flight deck, of course, they need rest and to be fed, and they need time off. And so generally about a 12-hour evolution is what we can do. So we might start in the middle of the day and end in the middle of the night, and we will fly missions, and it's called cyclic operations. So what happens is the very first event of the day, let's call it at noon, might launch, let's say 14 aircraft. Well, those 14 aircraft, they go out, and then let's say an hour later at 1,500, well, maybe another 14 aircraft take off. So for a short period of time, you might have 28 aircraft airborne. But then once they're airborne and gone and off on their mission, or their cycle, as they call it, then those first 14 aircraft from the 12 o'clock launch, they come back and land. And so for the rest of the day, you have this series of cycles where you launch aircraft and then recover aircraft. And at the end of the night, of course, you don't launch anything. You just recover the aircraft, and then you button up the carrier for the night and put it to bed. But what you do on those missions just depends on where you are. You might be doing actual missions. You might be doing training. You could be doing a show of force somewhere. You could be supporting an air show somewhere. So there's all kinds of different things the aircraft will be called upon to do. And generally speaking, it's not just, I don't obviously go tell someone, hey, I'm going to take an airplane and go somewhere. Quite the opposite. Orders come down from on high, and hey, this is what we're doing today. And then they'll say, okay, hey, you and you, Aiello, you guys are on this event, and this is what you're going to go do.
Yeah, and obviously you're, you know, in terms of what we were doing in the Arabian Gulf, you know, it was a coalition operation. So how do you integrate air power in its holistic form from those assets that come off the carrier to other assets that are joining, you know, from other nations, other locations? How did that work, and how was that integrated?
Well, it was integrated through the Combined Air Operations Center, the CAOC, as we call it, in Qatar at the time. I think it moves around depending on the theater. Of course, it'll be in different places. But you have, imagine a headquarters where you have representatives from all the different aviation units, and then you have the leadership that's in there that is taking the orders from on high and saying, okay, this is what we're doing. And so we'll put out what's called an air tasking order, which is a master playbook. So, hey, you Marines that are based in Kuwait, this is your mission for tomorrow. Hey, you squadrons on the ship, this is your mission for tomorrow. And so it takes all the air assets in the theater and it coordinates them all. It has standardized procedures. You have highways in the sky, as we call it, meaning you have a place to fly at an altitude, and it's at a sanctuary, so you can transit in and out from the Persian Gulf, let's say, to, in my case, southern Iraq during Operation Southern Watch or Iraqi Freedom. And so all of that is deconflicted and coordinated, and you have people to talk to. You have aerial refueling tankers, and then you have missions when you get there. Sometimes you might just be a presence. You're just available, like maybe someone on call. Other times you might go and, for example, one of the missions we used to do was fly down highways or pipelines to make sure that insurgents weren't doing some sort of destruction or planting IEDs. And so there's missions that are tallied out from the air tasking order, and that's what you do according to the tasking that has been assigned to you.
Yeah, and then in terms of the package that is launched off the carrier, you're not alone. You're going to be a group of aircraft. How would you operate together? Should you have to be used?
Well, we have procedures in place so that the entire carrier air wing, as it's called, made up of many different types of aircraft, although not quite as diverse as it used to be in the 70s and 80s. It's mostly variants of F-18s these days, but the F-35 is coming now. But you'll also have the E-2 squadron with the big disc on the top, like an AWACS. You'll have the helicopters, as we just saw. And so what we do before we deploy, we have what are called workups. Imagine, again, a team that has spring training for the coming season. Well, we'll go to a base here in the West, in Nevada, actually, not California, where we will go through a series of training where we say, okay, let's say the mission is this. Well, how are we going to do that? And so you'll have individuals who are attaining a certain qualification to be an air wing mission commander. And so we'll have certain procedures. They say, okay, well, we could have 4 of these kinds of fighters and 4 of these kinds of bombers, and we'll have the E-2C back here, and we'll have the helicopter ready in case someone gets shot down. And so there are those standards. And so when you go into theater, the idea is you've already rehearsed all that. You know what to do. You adapt it to the scenario based on so many factors: the weather, the geopolitical situation, international boundaries, the availability of weapons and tankers, that is refueling tankers, the target itself or the mission itself. And so there's all these variables. And so the mission planning is a big part of it. And then you go out and you execute, and you have one person in charge. That's the military way. You have the strike leader, and that person calls the shots. You have other people that can make recommendations, and you try to do what you've been trained to do. You don't want to, of course, all of a sudden change the plan or come up with some crazy idea that nobody will understand. Execute the brief. And that's part of what we do. Frankly, it's a big part of being a professional military pilot is, can you go out and do what you said you were going to do in the aircraft, both at the individual level in your aircraft, and in some cases, you might be in charge of 40 other aircraft.
Now, of course, that ability to go and execute those missions successfully depends on the training, which we talked about earlier. But of course, I'd like to move on to Top Gun now, and obviously that was the fighter weapons school that would have put you in the right place for that type of expectation of you as an airman. So give us an understanding of what Top Gun is and what it aims to provide you as an aviator who goes through there as a graduate.
Sure. Top Gun is called the Navy Fighter Weapons School, and I think of it as a graduate school for advanced air combat. It started as a result of poor performance in Vietnam, and it focused initially on pure air-to-air, but over time it has transitioned to air-to-air and air-to-surface, and then some ancillary missions. But the idea is that a graduate of Top Gun, which is about 12 to 13 weeks long, will be as good as anyone will ever be in the advanced tactics of being a fighter pilot. So you'll know how to dogfight exceptionally well. You'll know how to mission plan, because that is important. Maybe not as sexy and as glamorous as some of the other things we do, but it's very important to know how to plan to do a mission. You'll know how to drop bombs. You'll know how to support troops on the ground through what's called close air support, or CAS. And so when you graduate and earn the patch, then the idea is you can use that information to then help the others in your squadron or in your air wing to be their best as well. And the idea is to just accelerate and improve, if you will, the procedures or the effectiveness of those who are in your squadron and around you.
So you're effectively going back to your unit to then impart some of that knowledge and proliferate that around the squadron. And how does that work then? So you almost become a train the trainer essentially.
Well, prior to 1996, they would take junior officers out of their first squadron, send them to Top Gun as temporary duty, and then they would just go back to their squadron. And since 1996, when the program changed, what you do now is at the end of that tour, now you go to Top Gun on your way to something else. And so you might go to one of the training squadrons where you first learn to fly the F-18. You might stay at Top Gun or some of the sister units around it where they need Top Gun graduates. You might go to a test and evaluation squadron. And so there are different locations where you might go. And then after that tour, then you go back to the fleet as what's called the training officer. And now your job is to make that squadron the best it can be. But you're also maintaining the training jackets, if you will, or the progress of everyone from the most junior pilot who just reported aboard to the commanding officer, because there's always recency and proficiency that you require. You don't just learn this once and you're good forever. It's like a musician. A musician is constantly practicing, constantly fiddling with the instrument. My father used to play the violin, and so he would sit in front of the TV and he would just sit and run his fingers on it just to get that muscle memory. And so it's the same thing. Even the salty pilots that are the commanding officers need to be brought up to speed on the latest procedures, the latest recommendations, the latest threat information. And so that's what the tactics officer, the training officer is, that's his responsibility.
Right. Okay. Well, we've actually got some really cool original Top Gun movie trailer footage as well as the new one. So we'll play that while we're talking.
All right.
So you talk about threats. Now, obviously, that's one of the key elements of Top Gun, and you spent some time as a pilot on the other side as an adversary. So tell us about how that works.
Sure.
And how you train your U.S. Navy colleagues.
Right. So when I was at Top Gun, my subject matter expertise area was threat aircraft. And so it was my duty to be the Navy's point man on understanding the threat aircraft, which at the time was the MiG-29 Fulcrum and the Su-27 Flanker and a host of others. And the idea was that we know what these aircraft can do. At least we have a good idea, assessment. And then as an adversary pilot, it's your job. And in the movie Top Gun, for example, you see Jester and Viper and the A4 Skyhawk playing this role. It's your job to go out and fight against the blue, if you will. So we use colors. So the good guys, if you will, are blue, the bad guys are red. And so the students or the blue players are trying to learn the best way to employ their aircraft against what we think the adversary is going to do. So as the red air, as a training asset to the blue, it's your job to best replicate what we think the threat will do. So we don't always have the ability to fly those aircraft, but let's say you have an A4, like in the case of Top Gun. Well, if you want to use the A4 to simulate the MiG-21 fish bed, when you hop in the A4, you don't just fly the A4 to the maximum of its capability. What you do is you fly it in a way that you think best replicates the MiG-21. So you might not always use full throttle. You might not always use full G. You might not always use your radar in a certain way or your other systems, because that's not what we think the threat will do. So to be a professional adversary means that you don't always win. In fact, ideally, if you've done your job right and the blue players do their job right, you should lose, because we build our procedures to maximize the chance of the blue side winning. And so you go out, and if you get beat, then maybe you've done your job, but you want to replicate that threat as closely as possible. And so there's a whole community of doing that. And the F-16 is one of the aircraft we do it, as well as the F-5. And of course, nowadays here in the States, there are several companies, I should say, that are providing this service as a contract to the federal government. And they're flying interesting different aircraft like Hawker Hunters and Mirage F1s. And there are companies trying to buy F-16s and F-18s to use in a commercial sense. And so that's the job of the adversary pilot.
Yeah, interesting. I heard recently that there's a lot of ex-Australian Air Force F-18s have been bought up recently, for these commercial aggressor organizations, making it a bit cheaper for air forces to actually train their pilots. So we'll see more of those come around. Now, in terms of the realism that's provided by Top Gun to the student pilots, give us a sense of, you know, the training value that comes at the end of it. I mean, you talked about taking it back to the squadron, but give us a sense of what you actually achieve in terms of the individual.
Well, you achieve training to a level that you cannot get anywhere else. And the idea is that you then are the expert and you have this information not only for your own performance, but for those around you. And it's really hard to quantify it. I mean, it is an expensive program to go through. It is very valuable. And when you have that patch on your shoulder, then you're expected to be credible and approachable and humble and to be able to share that information that you have. And I don't really know how else to answer that, John, other than it's not just a ticket for a big ego. I mean, obviously, Hollywood takes several liberties with the way it depicts fighter pilots. But in real life, we try to be team players. We try to think about others more than ourselves. We try to support the people on the ground.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we're just looking at this the trailer here for the next movie. So give us your thoughts about the original movie and the movie coming up. I guess you had some friends who were involved in the original movie. Give us some perspectives.
Well, I have friends that were involved with both. And so I was 16 years old when Top Gun came out. And I already had the conversation with my stepfather that I mentioned earlier. So I was already ready to go, but certainly that movie did more for recruiting for the military than I think anything ever. And so it made being a military pilot very popular. And a lot of people wanted to do it, which was fine. I was glad that I was still able to do it. But I think what it did was it really depicted the majesty of naval aviation around the carrier and just in general. So the aerial cinematography was fantastic. Now, were there some issues in it? Sure. One of the episodes that we had on my show, the Fighter Pilot Podcast, was with the gentleman who was the Navy's liaison to Paramount for that first movie. And they talked about how they had to work on a few things. For example, Maverick is fighting over the desert, but then as soon as he's in the flat spin, he's heading out to sea, quote unquote. And so they had to obviously take some liberties to make the movie exciting, but also to deal with the footage that they had. So you do have, I think, a lot of the movie that's frankly exaggerated. But I think if, as I've said on my show, if they really made Top Gun like real naval aviation, nobody would go to the theater to watch it because it would be insanely boring. We spend a lot of time briefing. Now, they did show the debrief where, gutsiest move I ever saw. And those last for hours after a mission. And so naturally, Hollywood is interested in getting people to the theaters and making a compelling movie. And from that regard, it is. I still enjoy it. It's a great movie. And it definitely did well. But it's not completely the way that fighter pilots are. But again, if they had reflected that, it wouldn't have been as exciting. Now, Top Gun Maverick coming out, I have some friends that were involved, as you said, and the gentleman who was the liaison this time is also a friend of mine. In fact, he was also on my show and has promised that he would come back as soon as he's allowed to talk about it. And here we are, what should have been less than 2 weeks away from the release, but due to worldwide conditions, they've pushed that back to December of 2020. But we're excited about it from the point of view of our podcast, because if it's even half as good, and let's hope it's better than that as the first movie, it's going to be a reason to just feel good again about flying and just I just hope they get it right. I really have a lot riding on this from the point of view of, I hope it's not, again, they have to take some liberties. I understand that, but I hope it's not too much, because then I'll spend the next 6 months on my show trying to explain where they got it right and wrong. And people who join the Navy need to know that not everything is exactly like it's depicted there, but that's okay.
Yeah. There's a lot of expectation over here as well. I mean, it's like such an iconic movie, and it did a lot for the recruitment over here. And I heard recently that there are a few air forces, Western air forces, that are having a recruitment problem. So I think the sooner that movie comes out, the better. So moving on from Top Gun, you obviously spent a long time operationally, but eventually you ended up coming to your final assignment at the Fleet Readiness Centre. So give us an understanding of what that job involved, and what is the Fleet Readiness Centre?
Well, the Fleet Readiness Center is let's think of it as a hospital for F-18s, as well as other aircraft, but for the sake of this discussion, since that was the program that I worked in. And so if you think about people, why do they go to the hospital? Well, they go for several different reasons. One is they are just old and they go there maybe for terminal care. Some go because they have injuries. Maybe a ball player has a bad knee or something. And you might go there if you have an accident. And so the ambulance takes you there. So the Fleet Readiness Center where I worked was the same thing for F-18s. So the F-18s would go there if they were at the end of their service life, if they had been flown too hard, if they had a crash, frankly, if they needed something replaced. So that ball player with a bad knee, believe it or not, we had a procedure at the depot, as we call it, where you could replace what's called the center barrel. And so imagine, these days you have hip replacement and knee replacement. Well, imagine getting a new spine. That's effectively you're getting in a center barrel replacement on an F-18. And so the aircraft come there, they stay there a long time, frankly, and then they are put back together. And then once they do, then someone like me goes out and flies them. And then once we wring out all the final issues, we send them back to the fleet where the fleet can return them to service. And it's great for the fleet because these aircraft aren't being built anymore, at least the regular Hornet. We also had Super Hornets, but the regular Hornet wasn't being built. So even as the Navy was sundowning, as we call it, the F-18A through D, the Marine Corps is still flying them. And so we would send many to the Marine Corps. And so, John, like I said, aircraft come for a variety of reasons. My personal record is there was an aircraft that needed a new center barrel. It had high flight hours. It needed that annual checkup, if you will. It had not flown in 8 years when I hopped in it for the very first time. And it was an interesting flight, frankly. Yeah. But the maintenance folks there, they do a very good job. It didn't pass its post-maintenance check flight regimen, but it flew. And it flew fine, and it brought me back and a couple more flights, and we had all the bugs ringed out, and it made it back to the fleet. So it was an interesting job.
Yeah. Well, of course, these aircraft are, hugely expensive to, big capital outlay. So they need to be exploited and used as often as possible. And we talked earlier at the beginning about the fact that you're a Super Hornet check pilot. So you've flown all models of Hornet. And this check pilot job, got you onto the Super Hornet. How do the two, how does the initial model compare to the Super Hornet model? I mean, obviously it's a bigger aircraft. I can see that for looking, right. But obviously it's its performance, what it does on the inside, I suspect.
Yes. Well, they are very similar to the point where to be qualified in both at the same time is not a concern. You just have to remind yourself some of the different procedures, but they are, excuse me, very similar. And the performance is, believe it or not, the regular Hornet is maybe slightly more agile than the Super Hornet, but the Super Hornet was, in my opinion, a stopgap where the Navy needed something to get to what ultimately became the F-35, but the F-14 was going away. And so at that point in time, we'd been flying those missions that we spoke of earlier, John, in the Persian Gulf. And one thing that didn't come up, but I'll just mention briefly, is if you go out to just be a presence and maybe you're loaded with a couple bombs, well, when you come back to the carrier, you either have to weigh a certain amount. And so that weight is either in bombs or fuel. But you can't be over that weight or you could break something. And so if you don't employ the bombs and you bring them back, you have to have less fuel. Or if you jettison the bombs in the ocean, well, then you're going to go through bombs a lot faster. Well, the Super Hornet was designed with a much greater what's called bring back capability. And I can't help but surmise that maybe part of the reason they did that was because at the time, that's what we were doing predominantly, was flying missions where we never dropped and then coming back to the ship. And so from that point of view, it's a better capability there, but it's a little less agile. It's a little, depending on the regimen, it's not quite as fast, but it has new technology. It has the capability for a electronically scanned radar instead of a mechanically scanned radar. And so it's like a newer model of an automobile where it has new bells and whistles and gadgets, but it's otherwise very similar.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's certainly going to see the Navy through for another few years for sure.
Oh,
And
yes.
And the iconic F-14 Tomcat. I mean, that's it's probably an aircraft type that wouldn't have had much airtime over in the UK or internationally if it wasn't for the movie Top Gun. So, give us some thoughts on that aircraft. Did you ever fly in one?
No, I never flew in one. I wish I had an opportunity. Flew next to one several times, dogfight with them several times. It's an iconic aircraft, partly because it's just big and the swing wing, and it just has a menacing look. But certainly the movie Top Gun, and even before that, the Final Countdown certainly helped to give it some aura, if you will, that it's just one of those aircraft that just had all the right parts and pieces to really be to really capture the imagination of people. Unfortunately, when it was designed in the 70s, actually late 60s, it was operational, I think, in 1973. At that time, it wasn't designed with what we take for granted now, which is the ability to take out a box and put in a new one because it has a problem in it. It's not as maintenance friendly. And so as it aged, it became far more expensive to fly. And so while there's a lot of emotion around the aircraft, in fact, the business case of continuing to fly it quickly ran out of figures, if you will. And so it was retired, I believe, in 2006 or 7. And it was the right choice for the Navy. But of course, fans don't like to see their favorite aircraft go away. So it's been popular on the podcast. Our episode about it is still one of the favorites for listeners.
Yeah, sure. Well, talking of iconic aircraft, we've had a comment here on the chat from a guy called Martin Pert. I'm not sure if you've come across Martin before. He used to fly the Harrier, and he says, wouldn't it be easier to just stop, then land? When we were talking about Harrier landing. So a bit of banter there from the Brits.
Yes. Well, as Martin, I'm sure, understands, as we've said on the show, aircraft, as in so many things in life, are a series of trade-offs. So the ability to do that probably means you're trading off something else.
Yeah, probably weight or something like that for sure. But I'm sure he'll have some a response to that one shortly. So that was a really interesting insight, Vincent. Thank you so much for giving us some of the experiences you've had in a really interesting career. But I want to turn to your podcast because I've listened to a couple of them and they are really interesting. So give us some perspective on that. Why did you set it up, and what's your intention with it?
Well, as you said at the beginning, John, when you introduced me, I did have an amazing career, and I don't brag about that. I just feel like I was very fortunate. And all through my career, I would meet people who would say, "You're a fighter pilot? What's that like?" And so I just decided when I left the Navy after almost 25 years that two things. Number one, there's people out there that find this interesting. And number two, I didn't want to just walk away after a quarter century. And so at the time I had been a guest on another podcast and I enjoyed it and struck up a friendship with a podcast host. And we still are. And somehow I forget whose idea it was, his or mine, but we got to talking about, wow, there's not a single military aviation podcast out there. This was in 2010. And so I thought, well, is this something I could do? Maybe. I'm just a normal person, no broadcasting experience, but maybe I can figure it out. And so I looked into it. I was finishing a graduate degree program at the time, so I had to wait till then. And then as I was still in the Navy, I asked a friend of mine who is a judge advocate general, or a JAG, a lawyer. And she said, if you're in the military, you'll need to have everything cleared by the military. I said, all right, I'll just wait till I get out. And so when I retired in early 2017, I'd been working on it for a number of years. And then I was hired by an airline. So I had to go learn how to fly a Boeing jet. And so it got pushed back some more. But finally on January 1st, 2018, we launched. And I told people on episode 0 that, hey, I'm new at this, bear with me, I'll get better. And this is what we're going to do. This is what we're not going to do, i.e. we're not going to talk about the reasons conflict starts. We're going to talk about the role of military aviation in it. Despite the name of the show, which I thought was catchy, we're going to talk about all military aviation. In fact, we've had an episode on Coast Guard aviation. And I just want to explore this universe with people and share what amazing experiences I've had, and just open it up to people who otherwise all they know is what they see in Hollywood. And it's really taken off, John. I've been thoroughly impressed by the response. just by the intended target audience of the people maybe like you or me who wanted to do this, but something wasn't right with their eyes or whatever, but the young generation that's coming up next that wants to learn about it before they go do it. That has been very heartening for me as well. So it's really taken off, if you'll excuse the pun, and it's been great.
Yeah, well, we're certainly going to, put the link out on Twitter and Facebook and get people listening, because it really is a brilliant insight. So, well, look, that brings us to an end, and I've got a lot of questions here that have popped up. So I'm going to work my way through them, and I'm not going to take up too much of your time. But for now, I just wanted to, give our appreciation for what has been a really interesting look at a great operational career. So thanks for that.
You're welcome.
So the first question is a really, really easy question here. It's what's your most memorable moment when you were flying jets?
Oh, most memorable. Actually, that's not an easy question, John, because I have a bank of memories. I guess my first solo in a T-34 in flight school is one, if I can cover a couple. Dropping a bomb on a anti-aircraft artillery site that was firing at us over in Iraq in 1999 is another. But maybe the most memorable is, again, back to that 2008 PBS carrier special. I was on the ship when they filmed that in 2005, and we were off the coast of Australia, and we had some extremely heavy seas, and trying to land one night was quite the odyssey. It was nighttime anyway, but the ship, whereas if you imagine normal is just steady, and let's call that zero, it was up 20 feet and down 20 feet. So 40-foot swings. And when you're trying to land on a carrier at night, that doesn't work out too well. So I would say that's probably among the most memorable, because when I finally did land, I had so much adrenaline and just, I guess, fear, frankly, in my body, that as I was taxiing the aircraft to ultimately shut down, and you use your feet for the rudder pedals and the brakes to taxi, it was very difficult to do because the adrenaline was coming out of the large muscles of my thighs. And so my legs were just shaking. Yeah. And I thought, here I am finally on deck, and it's still difficult. It wasn't until I got into the ready room, and of course everyone was clapping because they were watching it on the TV, that I finally could take a breath and relax. But that was probably among the most memorable.
Yeah. So this is an interesting one. It's following on from that. What are your options if the carrier can't take you? So whether, I assume that must mean if there's an aircraft accident or something like that.
Sure. Well, you can hopefully divert to a field that can take you. You can wait until the carrier can take you. And in extremis, you don't hear about it too much anymore, but in Vietnam, particularly with battle damage, you could pull alongside the carrier. You could fly up right next to it and eject. And then the helicopter will pick you up. So that's obviously extreme, but the aircraft carrier works very, very hard to recover its aircraft. They don't like to divert the aircraft somewhere else if they can help it.
Mm-hmm. Now, this question probably comes from some sort of Discovery Channel documentary, the PBS documentary. The question here is, what is the role of an air boss?
The air boss is the gentleman who was previously a pilot who works up in the control tower that oversees the entire flight deck. And it's his or her job to make sure that everybody down there is doing their jobs. Now, he can't just say, hey, you go do that and you go do that. Everybody knows what to do. He has the big picture, or she, and says, all right, hey, watch out for that. Or, all right, why don't you guys stop what you're doing there and let's change this, because maybe he has some information from the captain that those folks down there don't know. So he is the orchestrator, if you will, as well as the main safety observer.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is a good one. So what aircraft would you have liked to have flown that you never had the chance to fly?
Well, there's so many. P-51 Mustang, but if you're talking military, probably the if American, the F-35. If foreign, maybe the Su-27 flanker. That would be pretty amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the question here is, do you still fly?
I fly for the airlines, and right now that's a little bit tenuous due to the COVID situation in the world. So I have not actually flown in that capacity since late March. But no is the short answer. I don't live particularly close to an airport, and I live in an expensive part of the country, so our surplus income is relatively small. So I don't spend it to do that. And I think the few times I do go fly in a smaller airplane, it's fun, but I like to have something to do. And so to just go fly, don't get me wrong, I love the pure joy of flight, and I wouldn't fault anyone who disagrees with me and does just like to go fly for the sake of seeing a nice sunset or whatever. That's fine. But I think at this point in my life, me personally, I've seen so many sunsets from an F-18. We had a photograph earlier of one of my very last flights where I was contemplating that it was almost over. But for me, I like to have something to do. So if I'm going to maybe take the family somewhere or do something, maybe someday I can be part of the Reno air races or an air show. I don't know. I haven't really thought too hard about all that. Then maybe so, but no, I don't just fly just for the pure thrill of it anymore. Believe it or not, John. I hope the listeners don't bring pitchforks and torches to my house.
No, I think you've had enough drama and excitement in your flying career, that's for sure.
Yes.
I think you've made up for that. Well, look, that's it. I'm gonna bring Mike Miller-Smith back in now, and we talk about putting things back into aviation from those that have had such opportunity, and I think your podcast is certainly one of them, and it's also today. We really appreciate you giving your time, and for us over here, it's great to see some insights into what it's like to fly jets off carriers and bring them back safely as well. So Mike, with that, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for a really fascinating talk. I think I speak for many aviators when I think one of the coolest things you can do with an airplane is take off and land on an aircraft carrier. So to hear that in the first person was just brilliant. So thank you for your time, Jell-O. That was just brilliant.
You're welcome, Mike.
We hope our paths will cross again soon. Now you're officially part of the Airbility family. So thanks for coming along. I
appreciate you having me, and I admire what you are doing.
Thanks very much. Well,
thanks.
Just one last reminder that the Armchair Air Show takes place next Saturday at 2:00 UK time. So we got some amazing airplanes, including the F-18, incidentally, and some airplanes from the US, from across Europe, from Australia, and even going into space. So I won't say too much, but do join us next Saturday afternoon. And just a reminder, thank you if you could consider supporting Airbility with a small donation. That would be absolutely wonderful. So thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend, and hopefully we'll see you again next Saturday for the Armchair Air Show. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.